episode 150.
Hooray!
Hooray!
3 years and a bit we made it.
Yep, just about a pandemic and still going strong. Well done, everyone. Still talking nonsense.
At least we're still talking to each other most of the time.
Hello, welcome again to Sports Unlocked, going through all the week's sports news with me, Rob Harris from Sky News, Martyn Ziegler from The Times, and Tariq Panja from The New York Times. And here's a career change. André Villas-Boas.
Interesting story. AVB, former manager of Chelsea and Tottenham in the Premier League, Marseille in France, Porto in Portugal. His first love is Porto. And he's been elected as the new president of Football Club Porto in Portugal. For the first time, the club has a president, a new one, in 42 years. How old is AVB?
Oh, I'm going to have a guess now that AVB is 42.
I'm saying 48.
46. He was 4 years old when the departing Nuno Pinto da Costa was first elected. Incredible. The guy had that club by the throat, really, for almost 5 decades. Incredible.
His predecessor, was he forced out, or did he finally decide that at the age of 136 he needed to retire?
No, he was a candidate in the election for another term, and was trounced. There was 3 candidates. Villas-Boas, extremely popular, certainly in the vote. 80%, more than 80% voted for him. He better deliver. But Pinto da Costa, just a very quick potted history. He helped establish Porto as one of the biggest teams in Europe, really. Two Champions League victories, which makes him one of the most successful teams in Europe, but also a degree of controversy around him. There were several investigations, a degree of murkiness around some of the transfer deals. But a new page is open 42 years later for FC Porto.
Has he said what he tends to do, Villas-Boas? Does he just accept Porto's position as, unable to sort of break into perhaps the elite again to be winning things like Champions League?
I think a lot of it is out with the old and with new, cleaning things up. The club has debts like a lot of these European clubs, a lot of kind of institutional bad behaviour as well. And it's going to be hard, though, isn't it? Portugal is a small market. Porto has punched above its weight, arguably, with Benfica, and to a smaller extent, Sporting on the European scale. How can he make them much bigger than they already are? It's a tough ask.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Villas-Boas replacing someone who's been in post for 42 years. No sign of term limits there, but we've talked so often about them in World Football, FIFA and the Confederations. But the theme more recently has been about busting those term limits, and questions now over whether the Asian Football Confederation will be abolishing their term limits too. That could allow Sheikh Salman to stay in power. This from Graham Dunbar of AP. And the Bahraini's been in the post since 2013. But how's this going to work with the term limits being removed? And how long can he then stay in power? Forever?
Well, it's one of those confederations which has been quite lucky in the fact no one is really noticing what's happening. They're one through a function of being where they are over there in Kuala Lumpur. The other thing, in the 2015 FIFA scandal, Asia wasn't really implicated in any of those investigations because it focused on CONCACAF in North America and CONMEBOL in South America and FIFA itself. This group has been insulated and they've been doing pretty much whatever they want. Yeah, Martyn, do you think Sheikh Salman, longest serving current regional president, will just keep on going and going?
Well, he'll probably keep on going as long as Saudi Arabia want him to stay there, I guess. Being a bit cynical.
And obviously this all flows back to the Reform Committee of 2015 as well, when in the wake of the FIFA scandals, that attempts were brought in place to limit powers of ability to stay on, to powers of patronage, and we're seeing all that roll back, aren't we?
Yeah, it feels like in the last few weeks on this pod, we've had different elements of this rollback being discussed. Last week we talked about all of those committees. this week we're talking about the term limits. It does feel like a general rollback in football governance across the board, doesn't it? And does anybody care? Does anyone meaningful care, like any authorities, any major stakeholders? It doesn't seem like anyone's making any big noises around this, does it?
Maybe, in fact, because it would remove term limits too for Asian Football Confederation Council, Executive Committee members too. So everyone can stay in post for as many years then as they wish, which keeps them in the committees, keeps them with all the various benefits that does bring.
Yeah, it does seem like it's the all those good intentions are flying out of the window just across the world. Lots of different sports bodies looking at it. The IOC considering it for the presidency, as we talked about. So it's not a good look.
Gianni Infantino's been in Washington this week. He's really shifted his focus, hasn't he, now with the World Cup heading to the US, Mexico and Canada, the Men's World Cup in 2026. Spent so much of his time more recently in the Gulf, but having to adopt a very different style, it seems. Glad-handing on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, he was in Washington this past week as part of the meetings with various officials required to make what's going to be a very, very complicated World Cup rollout. This is the first World Cup without an organising committee from any of the kind of domestic FAs. It's going to be a FIFA-delivered project. But one thing I noticed, Gianni Infantino had been to Washington plenty of times in the past when he was in his early presidency, and he wasn't shy of promoting and showing his proximity to the then US President Donald Trump. You know, he's in the Oval Office a couple of times. This week, there doesn't seem to be any kind of meetings with anyone substantially high-ranking in terms of President Biden or Vice President Kamala Harris or even Antony Blinken, Secretary of State. It seems different, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Been interesting question about which would FIFA prefer to have for the World Cup in 2026, Trump or Biden? Because he has met Trump previously on several occasions, but on the other hand, you think it might be a little less predictable if Trump wasn't back in power.
Well, it was in 2018 that Infantino went to the Oval Office and said to Trump, "You are part of the FIFA team now." And Trump replied, "That's good."
There's all that. Don't forget, there's also the
Davos?
The launch at Davos, where Trump hosted the dinner and he got Infantino to essentially be the MC or introduce the dinner at the start, make that kind of strange speech. There's been no very overt meetings with Biden, has there?
Yeah, Davos. Infantino called Trump a fighter. This was just as his impeachment trial was beginning.
That's right.
Based on his Instagram, he did meet the Homeland Security Secretary. So he did meet one of the members of the Biden cabinet, but certainly no one at the very top of the pecking order. Lots of footballs being handed over.
Well, that just shows this was very much a technical trip, because if you think about the importance of the Homeland Secretary that you mentioned there, this is visas. And one of the big question marks around the 2026 World Cup is about access to the United States for fans from countries that typically find it hard to get visitor visas to the USA. Talks of delays for over a year for some of these visas.
And it did strike me that when the World Cup was in Qatar or Russia, the Men's World Cup, it was all largely a sort of top-down approach of government, and you just had to speak to the people at the top and things would get done. That you do have to adopt a different style in the US with all the states. You've got to meet the various senators, the politicians across the country too, because you need decisions to be made on a local level, not just on a sort of federal, national level, and that can involve various bits of things in the system that could disrupt the hosting if you've not got those arrangements in place. So you've got to build a wide level of support for a country that's used to having big events and things. I mean, FIFA probably aren't the most important thing that they will encounter.
Yeah, good point, that Rob. I think it was Jerome Valcke, the former Secretary General of FIFA, who said, I think this was during his frustrations over trying to organise the 2014 World Cup in Brazil, saying that it's much easier to host a World Cup in a dictatorship. And absolutely, I think it's going to be quite problematic for FIFA and the USA, more so than if it was, say, for example, in France or Britain, because of all the different sort of regional governments, the federal states, all the sort of different police security. It's quite complicated.
Well, Brazil is the good analogy, isn't it? Brazil is a federative government as well, with state governments having a lot of power. It's the nearest, and it was quite complicated. But obviously,
I mean, we had the, I think the Rio state didn't we threatening not to be allowing the use of the American at one point for the World Cup?
there was a lot of various threats of litigation throughout that, and the delays. And for Valka, who wanted dictatorships or one-party rule, he didn't get a chance to kind of enjoy that, did he? Famously fired and now then banned from football following the FIFA scandal. So he didn't get to enjoy what he probably wanted, that environment of working under Vladimir Putin's Russia in the build-up to that World Cup, or the monarchy in Qatar.
I think he is enjoying working under Vladimir Putin now, though, Tariq, because he's running the new Friendship Games.
Right, what is that, Martyn? That's quite an interesting one. I noticed that. Give us some more detail. What's he doing, and what is this again?
This is the sort of Vladimir Putin's sort of rival to the Olympics, called the Friendship Games, involving sort of countries friendly to Russia. They're searching around for somebody to organise it, and Jerome Valcke is the man appointed.
Just wanted to make a point more on the discussion from last week on Aramco, the new Saudi sponsor of FIFA, the oil and energy giant. They've got a special status.
Yeah. Ricardo fought the former Coca-Cola official. He was responsible for Coca-Cola's long relationship with FIFA.
Former guest on this pod.
Yeah, former guest. He pointed out on his Twitter account, or X, he said FIFA is calling Aramco an, in quotes, major worldwide partner. He said that is something new in the FIFA vocabulary. Is the, in quotes, major with Aramco more important than the partner, Coca-Cola, Adidas, Visa, and Qatar Airways, etc.? It's saying they've put them on a pedestal all by themselves, this Saudi partner, and it might put some noses out of joint at these other partners. What do you think of that?
Is this a way of separating them because they're paying more, they're getting more rights, so they're not on the same level?
I think it has to be that. Then if somebody else complains to FIFA, another big sponsor complains, they'll say, well, hang on a minute, Aramco are paying double what you're paying. That's why we've sort of created this new category. But
well, is there not a then risk then say, right, lads, okay, see you later, pal. If we're not given the full status of our relationship with you and the north of $100 million we're giving you, and you're going to kind of relegate us, we don't want this. And then on the other hand, you're looking at the kind of culture in the Gulf, and you think there's always a VIP, another V, and you're kind of getting that. You want that kind of acknowledgement as the best guest of the party. So maybe there's something to that.
Maybe it's about prominence. You'll still have Coke, obviously, in the stadiums on tap. Maybe there's just more places you get your Aramco on tap in the stadiums.
Yes. You fill up your free bottle of Aramco oil here.
They are, of course, a sponsor for the 2027 Women's World Cup, aren't they? Yeah, of course, after Visit Saudi, originally due to be a sponsor of the 2023 tournament in Australia and New Zealand, and there was opposition to that. But yeah, 2027, and we're now getting a bit closer to discovering who will be the host of the tournament, because the US and Mexico have pulled out. The most logical thing to do, given they've got the Men's World Cup in 26, the Men's Club World Cup in 25, the LA Olympics in 28, so focusing on 2031 instead.
This deal was done, I think, the day that the 2030 and 2034 Men's World Cups were decided, the three continent, six country 2030 World Cup and the Saudi 2034, I think there was a package deal done. And we'll see when this is decided in a few weeks, that Brazil was going to be, CONMEBOL was told that there is a very good chance they will get the 2027 Women's World Cup. And I think this is how it's playing out. The USA is dropping out. What does that leave? That leaves Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands can't bid there. And is South Africa still in it? I don't know. No, South Africa have gone. So, yeah, all roads lead to Brazil.
Yeah, I think we've sort of mentioned that as they were the favourites before, but obviously now very much so. I actually now think what is interesting is what happens to the Women's World Cup in 2031, because the USA say they're focusing on that. South Africa is focusing on that. The European bid looks like it's going to miss out, and so Europe will think that it's their turn for 2031. So actually, I think that is going to be a really tight and political and fractious contest. And I know that the English FA have said that they want to host the Women's World Cup as well. Will they look at that and think it's the competition's too tough and we'll have to look at 2035 or even 2039 instead? I mean, it's not going to be straightforward.
It's a balancing act. What is the best decision for the good of the game or the good of those people on the FIFA Council and those interpersonal relations? Because clearly Europe has driven a lot of the growth of the Women's World Cup in recent years. That's the leagues putting investment in, the media as well, covering it. It does create another barrier to go to Brazil, but Brazil does bring that glamour, and we have seen them put increasing resource into the women's game in Brazil.
And also, I think that those stadiums that were built for the 2014 World Cup, a lot of them have been so underutilized. It's a chance for FIFA to give something back to that country, because there's a lot of angst still over the hosting of the 2014 World Cup. This slogan, Padrão FIFA standard, was going around the country at the time, while everything else was education and hospitals and infrastructure broadly were not getting the focus they were. There was this demand that stadiums had to meet a FIFA standard, and there's still a lot of angst. So maybe those stadiums can be used again. Do you think there's going to be a bidding competition in the traditional sense, or do you think, as we've seen recently, this will be a decision that we'll find out in a press release?
Will they just do a deal so there is no contest in the end? It's the new thing in world sport with all these bidding contests that no losers is the motto, it seems.
That'll be interesting if they pull out. I suppose there still has to be confirmed by a vote at the Congress in Bangkok in a couple of weeks' time, which we will be at least some of us.
Well, some of us were this week at the Premier League meeting. Yet another meeting of the Premier League clubs. There seem to be so many of these at the moment. Get into the details of it in a moment. Are they meeting so often because there's so many splits, they can't decide things? There's a lot more things to decide. We got used to this during the pandemic when they had a lot of virtual meetings because of the decisions over the return to play. Or they always had this many meetings, we just didn't cover them as intently. This one, of course, over the new financial rules.
Well, I think that what you mentioned is the reason there are so many. It is because of the Premier League's had a critical juncture at the moment. They are the first change to its financial rules since they were brought in 2013. So, the end of the very controversial PSR, profit and sustainability rules, from the end of next season, and then this, what's going to happen. We knew that they were going to have this sort of UEFA-style squad cost rule. You can only spend 85% of your revenue on wages and transfers. But there was I'd say a fairly historic moment. It still has to be confirmed at the full annual general meeting, but the first ever spending cap was agreed in principle on Monday. It's something called anchoring, where clubs in the Premier League, no matter how big your revenue, you will only be allowed to spend a proportion, say 5 times what the bottom club receives in TV and prize money from the Premier League, which is around about just over 105 million.
So the thinking behind this, obviously the new UEFA cost controls limit the spending on your squad at 70% of earnings. That's correct, isn't it?
That is correct for UEFA. They will get there. I mean, they're introducing it on the sliding scale, but in a couple of years' time, it will be 70%. Yeah.
So in theory, if you earned £1 billion, you could spend £700 million. So that's the reason for the need for anchoring. So you actually anchor how much you can spend as a maximum to the lowest earning Premier League club. So if that was in place last season, it would be around £500 million max you could spend. So it's an attempt to curb the spending power.
Yeah, but Martyn, Rob, these teams, you mentioned UEFA there, and we mentioned the Premier League. So I find it interesting that these teams are both in the Premier League, some of them, and are also competing in Europe in the Champions League. So to Rob's point, if Real Madrid earn €1 billion, and the anchoring, the 70% will be 700 million in Europe, and then the teams are in the Premier League, but they'll be if you say 5 times, it'll be less than that. They could spend 600 million euros. That 100 million gap that Real Madrid have potentially gives them an advantage, which is where I find it very hard when we have just these hard financial rules for teams that are competing in all sorts of competitions, regionally and domestically. Why are the rules for essentially, maybe you could say it's for ensuring bankruptcy and things like that doesn't happen, for financial safeguards. But in terms of competitive balance, why do we not have any sporting regulations? Why is it always a financial rule that is coming in either from UEFA or the Premier League? Why not sporting rules, guys?
Do you mean like why not? You can only have 2 signings a season, that sort of thing? Or?
Yeah, that sort of thing. The number of professional contracts, for example, a number of new signings, homegrown.
But this happened with FFP sanctions from UEFA, didn't it? Didn't they? They capped squad limits, didn't they? Didn't they reduce the size, say, Man City squad after the settlement in 2014, if I remember right? Yeah,
but that was as a penalty after a breach, but it's never in the regulations. It's always a financial thing. And guess what? The thing with these financial things, everyone tries to figure out a way of getting around it. Martyn described the PSR rules as controversial. They weren't controversial for the first 10, 12 years of existence. They've become controversial now because these teams have breached them and they've been punished.
Yeah, it's a good the point you make about Real Madrid being able to spend more than a Premier League club if the anchoring cap comes in is exactly why, for example, Manchester United are opposed to it. The Premier League clubs who are looking at it, their argument is that they look at Manchester City, Manchester United, their revenues are large. I think the club believed to be Manchester City are challenging the associated party transaction rules legally. If they win that, then basically any sort of associated sponsorship deals, they can bring in what they want. So if they're able to grow their commercial revenues to a ridiculous amount, then they will have the benefit of that spending power. And also look at the Manchester City, what they do with the City Football Group. Manchester City's, the number of employees they have 500 employees according to their accounts, and the highest wage bill of that, which is £423 million. Liverpool have lower revenues, and a slightly lower wage bill, but they have 1,000 employees. So there's this whole issue of using the multi-club ownership model to spread your costs, and that's why some clubs think we need to cap spending somehow without it, but tying it to what the bottom club receives. So there's a flexibility, and perhaps for that reason wouldn't be challenged by the players' union.
You could see the benefit. You can absolutely see the benefit of that in the Premier League. That makes perfect sense within that Premier League situation. But the problem is these teams have got their foot in so many other competitions. Absolutely right. And it's always Manchester City. We're still waiting now for the case of the 115 charges to be resolved. Premier League mired in litigation. It's not a good look, is it?
You mentioned the PFA. They said they're opposed to a hard salary cap, but they're opposed to something that doesn't seem to be happening.
I think they're worried about any sort of spending cap, aren't they? But it may be that there's enough flexibility in this to sort of get it over the line. I mean, I think if UEFA tried to do it, I think they would run into probably some fairly serious legal challenges. Because I think that's one of the Brexit effects is that that England, UK isn't quite as restricted into what it tries to do.
When we were at the meeting, and afterwards we discovered the voting from inside. So we discovered Manchester United and Manchester City were against, as were Aston Villa, which we'll get to in a moment, and Chelsea abstained. So why didn't Newcastle vote against it? Surely they need a load of spending, don't they, to try to catch up with the others? They've got the backing, certainly, but they're sort of held back by the rules from spending, and we've seen that this season where they won't make it back into the Champions League.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting that. Perhaps a sign that they're not sort of wedded to the sort of following exactly what Manchester City do, and also maybe an indication perhaps that the Saudi PIF doesn't want to throw a huge amount of money at it, and it is happy to take a sort of longer term view, and sort of it can build its revenues through. We've already seen they've got some Saudi sponsorship deals, and they can just use that and do it a bit gradually.
Just one or two. They're doing exactly the same thing as Man City.
I know they are, but I just wonder why they are. But on the other hand, they're happy to go along with the spending cap.
I think might be the other point you made. Maybe they're not that as interested as they were when. Don't forget the takeover happened before the Saudi Premier League launch, with PIF's focus very drastically on luring all of those players to Saudi Arabia, building those clubs up, building that league up. And Amanda Staveley, I noticed in a piece written by David Hellier for Bloomberg this past week, they might have not voted for it, but she did complain about these rules that are at risk of preventing growth. So it'd be interesting to see how that plays out. And if I'm a Newcastle fan, I would love to know what the intentions are, because as far as they're concerned, they'll be hoping that the Manchester City approach happens and they win everything.
And it's an interesting point you make there, whether or not the Saudis have actually seen a greater benefit from promoting their domestic league, both the men's and the women's league. We saw this week the end of the women's season being celebrated also by Gianni Infantino as well. And maybe they see that's more of a sort of long-term thing to build up their own country's football rather than that in another country.
Well, that's been the most visible focus of the past 12 months, hasn't it? And then we got the transfer window. Who knows, in a year's time, it might be the other way. They might be into Newcastle again in a big way, and we'll see that. But the fact it's in Saudi Arabia and it's visible to their population in such a meaningful way, maybe. But they're rich enough for both, I guess. Who knows?
Yeah. So on the Premier League rules, they do now have to go forward to the annual general meeting in June. They've got to finalise all the details of it. Aston Villa, who we discovered, voted against it, which was an interesting one.
Yeah, and Aston Villa have sort of teamed up a bit with Manchester City. They've sort of followed their lead on opposing associated party transaction rules, which you can see why multi-club ownership clubs might vote against that, because they want the flexibilities to move players between their clubs. But I don't think Villa is particularly in that model. So yeah, strange that they've sort of allied themselves with them. And also they raised the idea of raising the PSR limit, the amount of losses you can lose over 3 years for the final year next season, from 105 million over 3 years to 135 million over 3 years. There was no vote on this. It may come up again at the annual meeting, but that would infuriate Everton, Nottingham Forest, and potentially Leicester City, who've all run into trouble over the 105 million limit.
Leicester City this week securing their return to the Premier League, which of course they won 8 years ago, promoted as Championship winners. On the Premier League, we do have half American owners now, edging towards the 14 that could secure any change of Premier League policy, and increasing talk as well of whether or not Premier League games should be played abroad.
Yeah, it's something we've talked about a few times on this podcast. It does come up every so often, and we've had Adam Crafton from The Athletic did a very interesting piece around NBC, the Premier League's biggest overseas broadcast partner, $2 billion 6-year deal in the US for the rights, and their President of Acquisitions and Partnerships, John Miller, says he would love to see a couple of Premier League games open the season here in big stadiums, and that they're going to continue to push the Premier League for that. So, I mean, that sort of sets it out in no uncertain terms what they want. They're the biggest customer, but I think do you see the fans going for that? Because I mean, when I look at the comments under the piece I did on it in the Times online, hundreds of comments, and I would say 95% were absolutely opposed.
It depends what we talk about as a fan. Definitely, I think in England there will be match-going fans. We saw with the Super League those guys turning up at stadiums to protest, and I think we could see something similar in that sense. But of course, NBC, having paid that money, would love to have a Premier League or game or two in their season to launch it. So would, I guess, beIN Sports, who own the Middle East. They would love a couple of games in Qatar, and I suppose the broadcaster in Scandinavia would also love these games. But then, what are we talking about here? Do we just send the Premier League games all around the world to say, there you are, it's a global product, it's everyone's? Sorry, guys, 150 years of history, but this is now a commercial product and people are paying this stuff, so you have to watch it and it has to be played over there. I don't think it's going to go down well at all domestically, is it, Martyn, as you said?
beIN Sports did hold a Premier League watch party in Doha this week at the Beach Club. Didn't look the most lively of venues.
Yeah. Was it VIP, I take it?
Yeah, presenting some of their Premier League coverage from there. I think it was part of a sponsorship deal. But I think we are in an era of protest, aren't we? A lot of anger. We see people able to sort of make their mark. We saw it over the Super League, and it just needs even a small group of fans at each of the clubs, particularly in England, to take to the streets. The politicians who we see will get on board, even complaining about a flag on a shirt, that they can spot a populist cause. We saw it with them intervening over the ending of FA Cup replays, seized on that, got themselves some headlines. So, it's a potentially easy win for the politicians to get involved to speak out. Unless, though, that is they see a side benefit or it conflicts with other approaches they have. If it conflicts with things like their trade policy, because perhaps these Premier League games will be taken to a country that the government of the time needs to strike a trade deal with, or some helpful foreign policy or security arrangements.
Yeah, good point, Rob. Because the independent football regulator, the bill that's going through Parliament, does state in black and white that any decisions around owners or prospective owners has to take into account the UK government's foreign and trade policy, which is raising a sort of alarm bells with a lot of people, because that's just basically saying, if the UK has got a big sponsorship deal, a big trade deal, with a country, to say, for example, Saudi Arabia, then they will kind of get special treatment when it comes to the owners and directors test, which is just bizarre, I think. Not surprisingly, the Premier League have raised it as an issue in their response to the Department of Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee this week.
We've seen politicians in other countries get involved, haven't we, with clubs? This week, Nicolas Sarkozy, the former French president, while he was in office, he was very, very cozy, to be fair, with the Qataris. So much so, he held the meeting at the Elysee Palace, the famous meeting that delivered, some would say, Michel Platini's vote and others for the Qatar World Cup in 2022, and also the sale of Paris Saint-Germain to Qatar Sports Investment. So, Martyn, it wasn't that much of a surprise, or maybe it was, to see Nicolas Sarkozy sat next to the PSG president, Nasser Al-Khelaifi, Qatar's representative to sport, in a way, at the Champions League semi-final in Dortmund. Since that purchase, Sarkozy is a convicted felon. He's appealing his sentence for corruption in politics.
Yeah, was he wearing his electronic tag in the stadium?
No, it's a good question. That it's hard. I assume not, because the mag and bag search machine would have picked that thing up, and it would have been beeping away there. From what one of the responses I've got to this is that because he still hasn't exhausted all of his many appeals, he hasn't served his sentence, which was commuted, I believe, to house arrest. But it's a funny look, though, isn't it, for the PSG president there, Al Khalifi, with Sarkozy, given the criminal proceedings against this guy.
Something they probably hoped people wouldn't seize on too much, but of course they have.
It's also, do you think it's maybe people don't care? People don't care anymore about what optics look like, because, it's also another reminder of how Qatar got that World Cup right on the screen. It's not the sort of thing you want to see if you're Qatar, probably.
Yeah, I think the fact that the Qatar World Cup is moved on, then there's probably a little bit, people lost a bit of interest in the sort of intricacies about how they got it. So I think I think it's human nature. You look forward, don't you?
Qatar bidding for another event in rugby, linked with being the hosts of the new Nations Championship. This is starting in 2026. Matches between European and Southern Hemisphere nations in what Matt Hughes in the Daily Mail dubbed the Super Bowl of rugby. So matches over several days in November 2026.
Plenty of stadiums there, but they do sort of show up now and again for all sorts of events, looking for a home, by willing to accommodate competitions. But what is this tournament? Is it a new one, or is it something we're familiar with?
No, it's a new one. It's a sort of new idea. I think rugby's always desperately searching around to try and sort of bring in more money, and not surprisingly, there's lots of questions around the demands on players. Yet another tournament. This is separate from the World Cup, obviously.
Yeah, this is actually reminding us of the biennial debate in football when FIFA attempted to bring in a World Cup every 2 years. This is effectively a way of World Rugby bringing in a World Cup every, twice in a 4-year cycle too, because this would be involving at least a dozen nations, the 12 biggest rugby nations, all playing for a championship.
We're in this era of more and more, and it kind of has coincided with new investors. A lot of private equity coming into all sorts of sports, rugby also. New Zealand have taken private equity investment, and these companies are now all looking for a return. You wonder now if it's the cash first versus, for the benefit of the sport. They used to say, we need this income in order to grow the sport. But now you've got this private capital and looking for a profit. Potentially all these new events suddenly start showing up.
Yeah, still the big events in Qatar. Next year, it's the World Aquatics Championships, and it'll be interesting to see just the state of the sport then. Will we get the full conclusion and resolution to the WADA China case?
Yeah, well, there's things that kind of tension building up there, I guess, from the Olympics, from the 23 Chinese swimmers who we talked about before, with the New York Times ARD story around this, all failing tests for TMZ, the heart drug. and then cleared because of WADA, etc. They've been contaminated. There's been stuff this week, though, Tariq, around the Eric Cotier, the Swiss prosecutor from the canton of Vaud, who's been appointed to run the independent inquiry into WADA's actions.
Yeah, there has. So Eric Cotier, former Attorney General of Vaud. So people unfamiliar with Swiss cantons, Vaud is where Lausanne, the kind of head of where the IOC is based, a bunch of other sports. So it's essentially the hometown of international sport. So they found this fellow from there, which again has raised eyebrows. And then if you look a little bit deeper, there was a fellow at WADA, it's a guy, an auditor of their investigations committee. He was the former chief of police, it turns out, under Cotier. So this idea that this guy's really independent, they found this man with no connections, it's kind of raising some eyebrows because he gave the speech at the former chief of police's departure, who then goes to WADA, and it all feels a bit close. WADA have said, so what if these people know each other? This is a thoroughly independent person with a great CV. Who are you guys to doubt our commitment to get to the bottom of this, essentially? Very, very independent. Does it feel independent? That's the question. A lot of this is optics.
I like that. So what if they know each other? Yeah, so quite a lot. But it does seem like the canton of Vaud is so connected with international sport. I mean, you would say that a lot of these sports would have officials from Vaud on speed dial or Vodafone.
Vodafone also very good, but there's also a financial link I forgot to mention. The WADA has hosted many symposiums, or is it symposia plural? I don't know. In Lausanne, and one of the sponsors of these events has been Vaud, and in WADA's accounts over the last 20 or so years, they've benefited to the tune of about 135,000 Swiss francs or dollars, which might not seem a lot over that time, but it does create a link with this place. And again, WADA said, look, so what? A lot of people paid us significant amounts of money, including the United States of America, the biggest contributor to their budget, where Travis Tiger, the USADA chief executive, has been the biggest critic of WADA and this process.
And ultimately, it's about having faith and confidence in the process, and a lot of attention on just that tone of WADA, the combative approach, the questions that can even be raised about the independence of the person who's being brought in to hopefully try to give confidence around the process. And it's not just about the media. We've already had some swimmers speaking out, and we are building up to the Olympics, that there will be that residual anger that could be there ahead of the competition. Swimmers will have a platform, and they'll want to view that it is a fair playing field.
Will be there. I can't imagine this tension will not be there. It will definitely be there, listening to what they're saying now and what previous events have been like. Yeah, it's not going to be fun. It's not going to be a light atmosphere, put it that way.
Well, given us a lot to talk about over the last 150 episodes of Sport Unlocked.
Where will we be in 150 episodes' time, guys?
Well, we started talking about things like Super Leagues and challenges within European clubs, and the themes have continued all the way since then.
Yeah. Certainly,
so
no signs of slowing down.
Thanks to all those people who are running sports badly for giving us
giving so much material. And thank you to everyone for listening. As ever, welcome your questions and feedback. Can be anonymous. We'll discuss them. Message us at Sport Unlocked on X, Facebook and Instagram, and we'll get your messages. And if you hit subscribe, we land in your feeds automatically. But for now, thank you for listening. Goodbye.